thought it necessary, Mr. Speaker, to rise in support of this bit of legislation, principally because I wish that Hansard would record that I was part of history. And Mr. Speaker, that for me is of critical importance. A lot has been said, Mr. Speaker, and ultimately, I believe that this comes down to principle. It comes down to how we, as the members of Parliament, view this whole issue of good governance. Now, Mr. Speaker, good governance is language that we have heard much about, particularly in recent times. Many who sat in the seats of government for nigh 2 decades, those words never formed a part of their lexicon, nor did those words form part of their actions whilst they were in government. In opposition, a place that I have been, we know that sometimes we see things that we did not see when we were in government. And so now, good governance is the language of the day. And every radio station and every program we hear about good governance. But it comes back to the issue of principle. Because one cannot ask for good governance. And when good governance is presented, one hears sterile arguments about process. Because that is all we're hearing here today. It has been made plain, and I don't need to go back. It has been made plain what the process is to achieve this particular constitutional change. It doesn't add any value to this debate to start to talk about term limits and about recall of Prime Minister and relationship between St. Kitts and Nevis, Federal and NIA. Of course, all of those matters can be looked at, Mr. Speaker, in due course. But for current purposes, a government which in its campaign said to the public, to the electorate, we require you to put us in the seat of government. And if you were to do so, we will do certain things. One of those things that we will do is to seek to limit the term of the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, something very profound was said by the Honorable Attorney General. And I just want to touch on it for a brief moment. Because it is rare, Mr. Speaker, that anybody in a seat of power, privilege, and prestige is minded to lead the charge to limit that power, privilege, and prestige. It goes against the grain of human nature. But here we have a Prime Minister who is saying that this bill, this amendment, will apply to me and also will apply to whomsoever may come. That is profound, Mr. Speaker, and we ought not to take it lightly. Because what we have seen the world over is the opposite, where those who are in power, particularly those who are at the pinnacle, seek at all costs to prolong their stay there. And we know in some countries where there have been limitations, presidents and prime ministers have sought to amend the Constitution to remove those limitations. A backward step. And so as I listen to the honorable member from number 3, I am yet to hear, his constituents are yet to hear, and the people of the nation are yet to hear. What is his position?
Yes. Not principle.
What is his position as a matter of principle in relation to the question of whether or not a prime minister, a head of state, for our purposes today, the leader of the country, should have time limits imposed, term limits imposed on his or her leadership? We have not yet heard an answer. He has not said, yes, I believe in term limits, or nay, I don't believe in term limits. Instead, you hear obfuscation. You hear we should have gone back to the people. You hear my constituents did not vote for that. So if your constituents did not vote for that, where is your leadership in saying to your constituents that this, as a matter of principle, is the correct thing to do? Because we have not heard that. So we are hearing almost, if you will, people who lack principle, hiding behind form and elevating form above substance. So the question is an easy question. Where do members opposite stand on the question, which is a principal question going to the heart of this good governance agenda, to limit the terms of a prime minister so that never again in St. Kitts and Nevis could we have anybody sitting in that chair for 20 years. I do not need to go over what was said because all of us in the country know what happened, Mr. Speaker, when somebody felt that because of longevity in the chair, St. Kitts and Nevis belonged to them. We understood that. And that is why, as a principal position, we said in opposition that if we were to be catapulted into government, that we would seek to make this fundamental change so that never again would the country find itself back in that state. That is a principal position. So to come now and say that 8 seats were not won and therefore you have no mandate, that is a novel argument. Novel argument. Because I don't understand anyone to say that when you go out and you campaign, you say that you must give me a constitutionally required number of seats. You say, no, I'm asking you to give me a majority so that I can sit on the government benches and seek to bring legislation and to enact policy and legislation that will advance the country. I wish to point out for the record that the Constitution that we're seeking to amend, Mr. Speaker, says nothing about government. It says nothing about opposition. Instead, the wise men and women that framed that document spoke about representatives. You hear what the word is? Representatives. And representatives must have principle. Representatives must understand why they're here and what they're seeking to do. All of us, Mr. Speaker, are merely passing through. And I believe that the move and the Prime Minister has put it so eloquently. He recognizes that in his place right now in our history, that he's passing through. And he has come to make his contribution and then to give way for others to pass through. We talk about succession and succession planning. What do you want more than that? What do you want more than that? If this important amendment to our Constitution were to occur, Mr. Speaker, succession will no longer be an option, you know. Succession will now become a priority. Succession will no longer be something that somebody's walking around in their back pocket and saying, maybe, maybe not. Or as I'm hearing today, I'm going to die in my boots. I don't wear boots, so I know it's not about me. I'm going to die in my boots. That is what I'm hearing today. So, Mr. Speaker, succession will no longer be an option. Succession will now be a priority. Succession will now be a must. And every government, those of us who are now in government, those who are out of government wanting at some point in the future to get into government, every government will understand that if we get in there, whoever happens to be leader cannot do more than 2 terms. Now, what does that do? Because we are talking about good governance, Mr. Speaker. What does it do? It forces a government and a leader to start to work from day one. Because if he or she is to have a legacy, he or she understands they don't have the luxury of 20 and 30 years. You know, I'm looking very closely at the Trump impeachment proceedings in the United States. And there was a recent court ruling by a federal court judge who said that the president is not a king. That stuck with me. The president is not a king. And I believe I want to adopt that to say the prime minister is not a king. Nobody in this country, in a constitutional democracy such as ours, should appoint himself ruler for life. And we understand that where that happens, Mr. Speaker, it leads to difficulty. I'm reminded of something that I read some time ago. It says power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. The reason I make reference to that, because part of that is when people get in that chair and they start to feel that the chair belongs to them, that the country belongs to them. I have not experienced it, nor will I ever experience it. That is a dangerous thing, Mr. Speaker. And when a government sitting in the seat of authority in a country comes to the country and say that we will seek to limit ourselves, that we said so when we were in opposition, that we have come now that we're in government to do what we say we will do. That is what you call keeping your commitment. So when I hear all this cataflam, people jumping up and down and saying, Mr. Speaker, I didn't tell my constituents I will do that. Well, how many issues, may I ask rhetorically, that we confront in this parliament that we ask our constituents about? How many issues? How many things in terms of policy that are implemented and are discussed, that we discuss with our constituents? Remember for number one, you told your constituents you will build a new pier? You told them you'll fix all the roads and sinkets? Remember for number 7, you told them every year they'll get double salary? There are a number of things, you see, Mr. Speaker, that we engage with. If on every issue we have to go back to those who voted for us to ask them, you agree with this? It will be country run by referendum. You can't get anything done. And when I hear this sterile and futile argument advanced by the member for number 3 to say that even where the Constitution does not require a referendum, we must go to referendum, what sense could that make? The wise men and women who framed the Constitution understood that some matters warranted a referendum and other matters did not. So we know it's a fig leaf. It's an attempt to hide behind some formal and formalistic argument, when in reality, all we need is for the members opposite to say, as a matter of principle, do they agree or disagree? And if they agree, history will judge them. And if they disagree, history will judge them. And the question for all of us today, on which side of history do we want to be? That is the question. Because the headline has to be, if the members opposite vote no, to limiting the power of the prime minister, limiting the terms that the prime minister would be in power. If they vote no, then the headline has to be that they themselves do not see any value in the good governance agenda. And so when they go on the radio next, on the bully pulpits that they employ, to start to talk about good governance, people should remind them that when they had an opportunity to demonstrate principle, they opted not to. And that, Mr. Speaker, is a very important point. All of us have come, all of us here who are elected representatives, all of us who have the ability to vote on this matter. And all of us are prepared to say aye, because we want history to judge that this government, this unity government, elected on a platform of change and better for the country, has been the first government to bring constitutional reform of any kind to the parliament. Yeah. In 36 years of independence, it has never happened until now. And we have come here not with some cosmetic small matter. We have come with a matter of tremendous significance. We have come and we have said that the Prime Minister, indeed, he led the bill. He introduced the bill himself. Where do you hear anybody introducing something to limit themselves? Where? Only a unity government in St. Kitts and Nevis. We have introduced it. And now we hear the arguments as those who seek to shy away from the very thing they say they want, that they must go back to their people. Well, they had no opportunity to talk to their people in the year and a half that this legislation was tabled for the first reading. They had no opportunity in all the talk shows and social media to have a discussion with their people about this. What we have here are people who continue to pay lip service to good governance. But when the opportunity comes to stand up and be counted, they shy away. And one has to wonder. We have the leader of the opposition, the good member for number 6. Right Honorable. I waited until he came back. Has served 20 years. 20 years, Mr. Speaker. And it begs the question, what more? What more does the good gentleman want? What more does the good gentleman want? Most people after 20 years are looking towards retirement. Most people after 20 years, Mr. Speaker, are looking towards retirement. Most people after 20 years are looking for Jesus. Instead, the good gentleman for number 6 is coming in here to say that he is opposed to term limits. He is opposed to term limits. And I want, Mr. Speaker, the message to go forth throughout the length and breadth of this country, throughout the highways and byways of St. Kitts and Nevis, that the honorable member for number 6, having served 20 years, is coming back to say he wants more. He wants more. But I don't understand what more the good man could want. What more could he want, Mr. Speaker? Because if I were he, this is a time, I believe, for him to look elsewhere. To heaven. He said the other day, I'm a Christian. You heard that, Mr. Speaker? You saw the clip? I'm a Christian. First of all, I assume that being a born-again Christian and having found Christ late in his life, that he would seek to serve God, but here he comes today to say he wants more than 2 more terms, you know. He wants more than 2 more terms because we are saying that we want to limit the Prime Minister to 2 terms. And we're getting all kinds of opposition to what must be an idea whose time has come. Now, as I listen to the good member for number 3, he spoke about this 2 terms thing. And he seemed to have been making the case, Mr. Speaker, that somehow the 2 terms thing was novel. That's what I got. Because as he spoke, he said there's no movement. He mentioned Canada. He mentioned the UK. There's no movement. So I did a quick check, Mr. Speaker. In the Americas, Latin America and the Caribbean, There are 17 countries with term limits for their leader. 17. Of those 17, some, it would be interesting for the House to note, have limited their leaders to one term. Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Paraguay, all limit to one term. The majority limit to 2 terms. But 17 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have term limits. It is not a novel idea. In Europe, 29 countries in Europe have term limits. And for the European Union, the president is limited to 2 terms of 2.5 years each. 29 in Europe. Oceania, Australia, and those countries in that part of the world, there are 9. In Asia, 23 countries have term limits. And in Africa, Mother Africa, 40 countries have term limits. Some of the countries that have term limits include countries like Cuba, Nigeria, countries like Iraq, countries, and I mean no, I don't mean to be disparaging anyway, but countries that traditionally we would not look to as having the best records in terms of democracy. But yet they see the value in these countries of limiting the term of the leader. So it is not a new idea. 17 countries in the Americas, 29 countries in Europe, 9 in Oceania, 23 in Asia, 40 in Africa. 17 out of 34. That's half. Most of the members of the OAS have term limits. And in the Caribbean, we have heard Guyana and Belize. So the question has to be asked, what is the fear? What is the danger? What is the concern of those members opposite? If indeed the member from number 3 speaks for anybody more than himself. What is the concern? Because what we are seeking to do here has been done elsewhere and has been perceived in those countries where it has happened as an important check, an important balance, an important provision as part and parcel of the good governance agenda. People say they want electoral reform. They say they want good governance. Well, what better electoral reform could you have than saying that the leader of the country is limited? Good, bad, or indifferent. What better signal can you send to young people that they too will have an opportunity? They don't have to wait for 20 years. Have the good member from number 6 has it wait for life. An opportunity to come and to serve and to have an opportunity, if they so desire, to aspire to the highest office in the land. It creates momentum in the democratic process. It provides an opportunity for St. Kitts and Nevis to say and to stand up in every forum in the world and say that we are moving in the right direction insofar as our democratic ideals are concerned. Who could be opposed to that, Mr. Speaker? Who? I hear the Prime Minister say they want incentive, and that too is what I'm hearing. They say you say bad things about us and you still want our vote. It's not about what we say. It is no secret that members opposite and members on the government side have fundamental differences of approach, fundamentally different ideas. There's nothing wrong with that. And to point out what was factual. The Prime Minister was not engaged when he presented this bill in fake news. He was factual in pointing out some of the excesses that occurred when someone stays in the chair for too long. When that happens, it leads to the type of excesses that have been described. It leads to that. So, Mr. Speaker, the point, you say, Mr. Speaker, the crosstalk is useful sometimes, you know, because you hear the vernacular again. Good governance, democracy. And for those who are either ill-informed or misinformed, if you say it enough, people think you stand for it.
I stand for it.
People think you support it.
I support it.
Well, if it is you have,
and the people out there know that.
if it is you have had a come to Jesus moment as you're professing, and you're willing to stand up in the well here and seek forgiveness from us,
You want to baptize me?
I can't baptize you,
So you want to baptize
but you must ask forgiveness, because you can't say that you support good governance and democracy and had emotional no confidence pending for 26 months. You can't say you support democracy and good governance and brought in a man here as a senator unconstitutionally to vote. You can't say that you run and run and run from emotional no confidence for 26 months. You run as night run till morning catch you. So how are you going to say that you support democracy and good governance unless you have had a change of heart and you're prepared now to come to the nation and say, Mr. Speaker, maybe I should now sit because we have come close. We have come close to a confession. Come close to a confession. It's a pity, you know, Mr. Speaker, that among your many duties, you don't have the ability to give communion and to sprinkle some holy water. Because it has to be that is what the member from number 6 needs at this stage. Because people, you see, is what a man who has spent a lifetime doing wrong. A man who has, this is purely,
Are you speaking
generally.
Not those who are
No,
Christ.
this is purely rhetorically
Okay,
and anecdotally.
So not
But
somebody
if
who's
a
gone
man
to confession.
has spent a life doing wrong, unless he were to come and confess to that wrong, he can't just stand up and say, I'm a changed man. No. He has to come and kneel before the people and say
Say if you want him to kneel.
that I have wronged you.
Yes, if you want him to kneel.
I have wronged you. And you must first seek absolution and forgiveness before you can move on.
And you don't need a mandate to do that.
You're right.
You don't need to go back to the people to do that.
But so many people simply profess that they now stand for that which their actions say they are opposed. They just say so. And it is a question now for the electorate to determine whether or not they accept that those who have openly professed the bad from the barn. Where in the world you ever hear any leader stand up and say, I, bad from my barn? Most of us, at least, we try to be good.
No. I don't want to interrupt you, but don't say that. Don't say that.
I don't understand, Mr. Speaker. And that can only come from sitting too long in the chair. Because when you sit too long in the chair, you start to believe your own foolishness. You know? No, Mr. Speaker. My simple point is this. That Mr. Speaker, the simple point, Mr. Speaker, is this. The simple point is this. We who are here today, we who happen at this point in our history to be members of this honorable house, have been presented with an opportunity here to do the right thing. And it doesn't matter which side has sought to bring this legislation. The question we must each ask ourselves is it the right thing to do? And if the answer to that question is yes, then it matters little who brought the legislation to the Parliament. Because all of us should be invested in creating a better democracy for St. Kitts and Nevis. All of us. And that ultimately, Mr. Speaker, has to be the question that each of us must ask ourselves. This is a vote of conscience. It's a matter, I go back to the word I started with, of principle. Each of us must determine where do we stand in important times such as this, at a crossroads in our history, our parliamentary history, our constitutional history, our democratic history. Yeah. Where do we stand? Yeah. I know where I stand. And anything that makes our democracy stronger and makes it better has my support. And I don't need to go back to ask the people of number 9. I don't need to tell them why when you vote I didn't expressly discuss this particular point with you. Because I understand that the people of number 9 expect me to do the right thing. And they expect me to lend support to good ideas, regardless of where those ideas emanate. That is what they expect of me. And that is why I am here. And I have decided to stand on this Thursday afternoon to give my fullest support to this particular amendment. Now, Mr. Speaker, there is a lot that I had planned to say about the process, the constitutional process. It is true that we would require members opposite to vote. In fact, we only require 1/3 of a person. Given the stature of the member from number 6, he might qualify as a 1/3 in terms of height. But, Mr. Speaker, we require less than 1 person on the other side. And the question will be, the member for number 2, having indicated that she could not be here. The member for number 3, having spoken, said much, but ultimately said little. We are unsure as to where he stands, because he says he has to go back to ask the people in number 3 what he should do. The member for number 6 is here. He has been saying things in crosstalk, but I am hopeful that when he gets to his feet, he'll answer the fundamental question. Are you in favor of good governance? Or are you not? And if you are prepared to do more than lip service, then the only answer today is to vote yes. The good member for number 11 is here. I'm not sure where he stands either. I'm here and he was elected, 4 of them were elected on the same platform.
He misspoke.
Might have been that there was some misspeak in that statement. But again, each of us on this side, each of us on that side, each of us has to search our conscience, because ultimately, Mr. Speaker, each of us will have to be answerable for our vote in this House on this important matter. So you hear the argument, the spin already started. Oh, they know they couldn't get the votes, and they come in just to say they tried something. It's a spin, you know. You could hear the spin masters, and a word I learned today, the alligators, already started. And I am saying, you spell it with an E and not with an I. So, Mr. Speaker, we have here before us an important historical matter. And we have before us an important decision that is required on this historical matter.
Yes.
And each of us will have to answer for our decision taken here today. Each of us will have to answer. And for my part, I do not believe that anybody who votes against this measure should ever again be able to lecture anybody about good governance. They should never again be able to lecture anybody about electoral reform. And I'm hopeful that the members of the public who are listening and viewing will themselves understand that a government in good faith brought to this house legislation on which all men and women of principle could agree.
Yeah.
And we brought that legislation, Mr. Speaker, in order to advance our country. In order to become the first in the Eastern Caribbean and the OECS to have term limits imposed on the office of the Prime Minister. And for those who oppose, one is led inexorably to the view that they oppose term limits because they want to be in there for life. Once they could win by any means possible, they will remain for 5 and then 10 and then 15 and then 20. And then after 20, the people give them a break. They want to come back again and ask you for another 5 and another 10 until they die in their boots. That is not what the country either wants or needs. And when the people went to the polls in 2015, the people voted overwhelmingly for a team that said, we are going to do different. So I hear sometimes now the argument, Mr. Speaker, and the one deployed by the good member for number 3. Why now? Why so late? You should have done it earlier. Well, would his view have been any different earlier? No. Because his argument was that his people did not vote for that. And we must go to a referendum to find out what the people say, even when the Constitution is clear that no referendum is required. So why the posturing about we should have come earlier? As far as I know, the Constitution gives us a 5-year term.
Yes.
That's the term.
Yes.
And it therefore means that for every day, every minute, every hour that we are in government, we must continue to do the people's work.
Yes.
And whether something comes on the first day of the 5-year term or it comes on the last day of the 5-year term, the question and the only question that the public must ask, Mr. Speaker, are these people doing what they committed to do? And the answer to that is yes. I don't need to ask for anybody to lend me the manifesto, because the Honorable Prime Minister and mover of the bill has dealt with that. The Honorable Attorney General has dealt with that. And what the manifesto provides is a blueprint. It's a roadmap. And in anybody's estimation, when they're then required to assess what a government has done, they look to the roadmap. And they say, when you came to us 5 years ago, you said to us this is what you would do. And the question, therefore, is, have you done that which you said you would do? And the answer, Mr. Speaker, overwhelmingly is yes.
Yes, yes, yes.
Overwhelmingly is yes. And so it almost appears that those opposite want to prevent us from ticking another box.
Yeah.
So they come up with a ruse, a sham, and they start to make arguments, which I do not believe, Mr. Speaker, even a kindergartner would seek to make. And so I end where I started. We, all of us, have to make a decision today or whenever this debate is concluded. And whenever there is a division as is required, and each of us will be asked, how do you stand on this issue? And each of us Mr. Speaker, we'll have to search ourselves, our conscience, and say whether we stand on the side of good governance, better democracy, electoral reform, and all of the lofty ideals that we have been advocating on the airwaves, or do we want to go back to a position where somebody, through any means, can remain as Prime Minister for 20 years and 25 years and 30 years and get to a point where he or she feels that the country belongs to him or her. That is where the rubber meets the road. And so, Mr. Speaker, I had to stand and I had to say something because I want it to be recorded that on this day in our history, the member for number 9 stood up and supported this amendment because it is, for me, a fundamental step in the right direction towards better governance, towards greater transparency, towards greater accountability, towards a better democracy. And that, Mr. Speaker, is what we are seeking to achieve. And so with those words, I want to lend my fullest support to this bill, short bill, 3 paragraphs, but a bill that is profound in terms of its implications for our little country. And I end by asking the members opposite to do the right thing and to be counted on the right side of history. Let us be proud of this Parliament and this day in our history that we can say, collectively, the representatives voted unanimously for good governance and for a better system of government in this country. With those few words, Mr. Speaker, I wish this bill safe passage to this honorable House.